Okay, welcome back to part 2 of Phil 375, our week on SART and nausea. So, now that we have situated our discussion of SART in conversation with Iris Murdoch, I'm going to talk a little bit about existentialism and just a few main concepts to help us determine if there is evidence of this philosophy in the text that we're examining. So I'm going to talk about a phrase and two concepts. The phrase is existence precedes essence. And then I'm going to talk about freedom, and I'm going to talk about creating oneself. So the phrase existence precedes essence is an existential maxim. It is a rule that all existentialists follow. What does it mean? Well, literally, it means that existence comes before essence. We can also ask about what existence and what essence mean. But as a sentence, it means that there is nothing that dictates a person's character, nothing that dictates their goals or their values other than themselves. So the only thing that the individual can define, the only thing that can define the essence of the individual is the individual themselves. According to Sartre, this is a quote: "Man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards." So it's not the case that there is, according to Sartre, any idea of us before we come into existence. It's actually helpful to look at this phrase in reverse. So to ask what it would mean for essence to precede existence. And Sartre gives us an example of this. So it would mean something like there is an idea of either a person or an object before it comes into existence. So this is the example that Sartre gives. It's a little bit modified. His example is that of a paper knife, which was used to open books before we had machines to cut books, the edges of book pages. I'm going to use a letter opener to illustrate this example, and please forgive me, but we don't really use paper knives anymore. So this is a letter opener. This is actually a combination pen and letter opener. So this is the letter opener end, this is the pen end. But the idea here is that this letter opener, according to Sartre, is an object that has a purpose. So it was created for a reason. And in this way, the paper knife was produced before it existed. There was a need for it. So someone wanted a way to open up their envelopes without messing up the top of them. When we could only communicate long distance with letters, you would acquire lots of letters over your life and, want a way to keep the top neat so you could organize them. I don't know. And someone thought it would be nice to have a thin little blade to slip in there. Maybe they tried some other kind of blades. Maybe their paper knife was too big, so that's how the letter opener got invented. But the thrust here is that in this sort of way, the letter opener was first imagined, there was a need for it, and then it was created. So we can say in a sort of way that production here preceded existence. It was produced as an idea, and then it was made. And it's actually a bit weird to think about the letter opener to be created without a purpose, because it is so specific. It is so specifically designed. I could use it for something else. I could use the letter opener to cut a tomato, but that wouldn't be the purpose that the letter opener was created for. And it's also important to note that an essence would not necessarily be a purpose or require a designer. So it could be a fixed personality or a predetermined set of traits. So instead of an object like a letter opener, a human being with certain already agreed upon characteristics could be said to have an essence before they actually exist. So Existentialism reverses this. We are not like the paper knife. Existentialism says that we need to have the concept of something before we create it. And there is no concept of me before I'm born. I'm not imagined before I existed. There is no concept of me before I was created. And this is because existential thinking is conditional on the denial of the existence of God. There is no God, and there is no designer or creator of my soul. Heidegger says that we are thrown into the world, and this suggests that it's some sort of shocking experience, the way that we come into the world. So what happens if there's no God? Sartre says it would make sense for a person to have an objective purpose if they were created by God, but when God's out of the picture, this isn't possible anymore, and objective morality isn't an option. So in other words, we are condemned to be free. There's no other option than this sort of absolute freedom. But just because there's no such thing as objective morality, this does not mean that morality doesn't exist. And that's why I wore this sweatshirt today. It says life is meaningless. And this is an example of what existentialism is not saying. So it's not that life is meaningless, but we as people must create meaning. Sartre just doesn't think that there is a law that determines what morality is. It's just humanity. So he rejects the idea that humans are certain kind of beings, ones that have a moral purpose. And some people said that this made existentialism gloomy, or that it was depressing to not have a purpose. And that's who Sartre is responding to in this text. So this is actually a lecture that he gave in response to his haters who were saying things like, he says, my purpose here is to defend existentialism against some charges that have been brought against it. Others have condemned us for emphasizing what is despicable about humanity. It's been blamed for encouraging people to remain in a state of despair, considering man an isolated being. And again, that is not what existentialism is. Existentialism is not saying that life is meaningless and that there is no purpose. And Sartre insists that that his philosophy is actually optimistic because it encompasses his notion of freedom. So, what kind of freedom are we talking about? Well, existence precedes essence is a declaration that humans are fundamentally free. So, in other words, if there's no God, there's no designer or creator of our souls, this lack of nothingness this lack or nothingness allows us to be free. So, at one part of the novel, Quentin says to himself, I am free now. I do not have the slightest reason for living. And I wanted to bring up that quote and encourage you to think about what Roquetin does when he realizes that he's free. And an important part of this freedom is that when we're choosing, we're not just choosing for ourselves. When we give moral value for something, we're doing it for all of humanity. So we need to choose what we think everyone should choose when we pick how to live our lives. So an example of that is being a compassionate eater. So if I believe that it is important to consider the environment and to consider animals when I am making choices about what I am eating, if I'm an existentialist, then I believe that everyone around me everyone at all actually, should be doing the same thing and should be acting the same way. And it's important to note that existentialism is not relativism. So it's not the case that the existentialist believes that, okay, you do your thing and I'll do my thing and we'll both just do what's good for ourselves. It has to be something that we want everyone to be doing. And existentialism is also not atheism. So nothing would be different even if God did exist. I don't think that it would be possible to prove that God doesn't exist, and it's better to think of existentialism as a drawing out of the consequences of atheism. And one of those consequences is that humanity has this responsibility once God is no longer responsible. And this can't be outsourced. So everything comes down to our own choices and our own personal responsibility. We can ask other people, we can ask our mentors for advice, but ultimately we won't find anything outside of ourselves. And this is a big ask, and it's not an easy thing to do, and it's a lot to ask of someone. And that's why I think we should look at Roquetin and see what he does once he has this realization. And again, this is in a way what it means to be condemned to be free. And in some ways, it's a lot easier. It's a lot simpler if we had just a predestined path to follow. Like, a lot of worries would go away, right? I mean, also other concerns would pop up too. And I think that there's also something to be said here for, so we just talked about freedom, and there's also something to be said here that's very closely related, but it's about creating oneself. So not only are we fundamentally free, but man begins as nothing and then comes into the world and encounters himself. So we choose our own morality, and this isn't an easy thing to do. So the example that I want to give is called the free French example, where we have a soldier, or I guess a young man who is of the age that he should be going off to war. Sartre fought in World War II, so we can consider that as some context in which he's writing. And the dilemma is that he has to choose whether or not to stay with his mother as the only son to support her, or to go off to war like he's supposed to. And the outcome here is that there is no right choice. Objectively, we have to decide what happens ourselves, and no one else can pick for this young man what is better for him to do. And in this way, we are sort of suspended between being and nothingness. That's the title of Sartre's longer work, where he also discusses different types of being. But in general, there's this idea that we are in the world and we are being, in one sense, being with each other. But then there's also this sense of nothingness, and we hang somewhere in between those two things. So Nausea was Sartre's first novel, and it was actually his first work ever, a precursor to the philosophy that he later writes about in Being and Nothingness. But I want to end by talking about Simone de Beauvoir, who was a contemporary of Sartre. She was a prolific writer and philosopher, but she did not call herself a philosopher at the time, although many others called her one, and her ideas can definitely be said to be philosophical. So what she actually did was she took Sartre's ideas, in particular the idea of existence precedes essence, and applied that to feminism. And Simone de Beauvoir actually has her own maxim, on ne naît pas femme, on la devient, which means one is not born, but one becomes a woman. And this is later taken up by Judith Butler, and the idea here is that the body is not female. It is made female. And being female and being a woman are fundamentally different things. So being a woman is not about a certain part of anatomy, or it's not about a certain function that the body has. So that is your quick and dirty summary. Please try to hold these ideas in your mind as you're reading or rereading, and think about anything else that strikes you as perhaps representing one of these concepts that I've discussed, or about philosophy in general. And so look for how the novel is doing philosophy, and please get in touch via email if you want to. Enjoy the book, and also keep your feelers out for this feeling that Sartre is trying to convey, that Murdoch says existentialism is uniquely positioned to do. I'm really looking forward to the discussions this week, and I'll talk to you on Friday.